in which an affair unfolds, and we see the damage wrought upon the scorned. Chapter 11. That which, for almost a year, had constituted the one exclusive desire of Vronsky's life, replacing all former desires, that which for Anna had been an impossible, horrible, but all the more enchanting dream of happiness, this desire had been satisfied. Pale, his lower jaw trembling, he stood over her and pleaded with her to be calm, himself not knowing why or how. "Anna, Anna," he kept saying in a trembling voice, "Anna, for God's sake." But the louder he spoke, the lower she bent her once proud, gay, but now shame-stricken head, and she became all limp, falling from the divan where she had been sitting to the floor at his feet. She would have fallen on the carpet if he had not held her. "My God, forgive me," she said, sobbing, pressing his hands to her breast. She felt herself so criminal and guilty that the only thing left for her was to humble herself and beg forgiveness. But as she had no one else in her life now except him, it was also to him that she addressed her plea for forgiveness. Looking at him, she physically felt her humiliation and could say nothing more. And he felt what a murderer must feel when he looks at the body he has deprived of life. This body deprived of life was their love, the first period of their love. There was something horrible and loathsome in his recollections of what had been paid for with this terrible price of shame. Shame at her spiritual nakedness weighing on her, and communicated itself to him. But despite all the murderer's horror before the murdered body, he had to cut this body into pieces and hide it. He had to make use of what the murderer had gained by his murder. And, as the murderer falls upon this body with animosity, as if with passion drags it off and cuts it up, so he covered her face and shoulders with kisses. She held his hand and did not move. Yes, these kisses were what had been bought by this shame. Yes, and this one hand, which will always be mine, is the hand of my accomplice. She raised this hand and kissed it. He knelt down and tried to look at her face, but she hid it and said nothing. Finally, as if forcing herself, she sat up and pushed him away. Her face was still as beautiful, but the more pitiful for that. "Everything is finished," she said. "I have nothing but you. Remember that." How can I not remember what is my very life for 1 minute of this happiness? "What happiness?" she said with loathing and horror, and her horror involuntarily communicated itself to him. "For God's sake, not a word more." She quickly stood up and moved away from him. "Not a word more," she repeated, and with an expression of cold despair on her face, which he found strange, she left him. She felt that at that moment she could not put into words her feeling of shame, joy, and horror before this entry into a new life, and she did not want to speak of it, to trivialize this feeling with imprecise words. But later, too, the next day, and the day after that, she not only found no words in which she could express all the complexity of these feelings, but was unable even to find thoughts in which she could reflect with herself on all that was in her soul. She kept telling herself, "No, I can't think about it now. Later, when I'm more calm." But this calm for reflection never came. Each time the thought occurred to her of what she had done, of what would become of her, and what she ought to do, horror came over her, and she drove these thoughts away. Later, later, she kept saying, when I'm more calm. But in sleep, when she had no power over her thoughts, her situation presented itself to her in all its ugly nakedness. One dream visited her almost every night. She dreamed that they were both her husbands, that they both lavished their caresses on her. Alexey Alexandrovitch wept, kissing her hands and saying, "It's so good now." And Alexey Vronsky was right there, and he too was her husband, and marveling that it had once seemed impossible to her, she laughingly explained to them that this was much simpler, and that now they were both content and happy. But this dream weighed on her like a nightmare, and she would wake up in horror. If you enjoy this format, please leave a like and subscribe and return tomorrow for the next chapter.